Its army stands accused of genocide, but Myanmar's a great place to do business. That's the message from a conference here in London this week. Should Britain be trading with a country with a record of atrocities? You're watching Roundtable. Good to have you with us. I'm David Foster. One of the world's most exciting investment destinations, says the promo material for Myanmar Trade Conference taking place in London this week. What the brochures do not mention are the allegations of state-sponsored murder and atrocities committed against millions of Rohingya Muslims.
Myanmar is catching up on decades of underdevelopment. Strategically located between China and India with plentiful natural resources, it presents opportunities for foreign companies. After decades of rule by a military junta, landmark elections took place in 2015. But the new era of optimism was short-lived. In the same year, news began emerging of the persecution of Rohingya Muslims. Myanmar's military has been accused of murder, rape and forced displacement. An estimated 900,000 refugees have fled to neighbouring Bangladesh. The UN has described the situation inside Rakhine State in Myanmar as a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. The US is one of the only countries to apply sanctions on a handful of senior army generals. So far, the country remains open for business on the world stage.
Joining me at the round table today, we have in Brussels Danny Murty, an EU trade agreements expert. In the studio, Thomas Macmanus, lecturer in state crime from Queen Mary University of London. We have Justin Wintle, historian and author of Perfect Hostage, Aung San Suu Kyi, and Mark Farmaner making up our panel, director of Burma Campaign UK. Great to have you all with us. A fantastic place to do business. Let's go to you first of all, Danny. That's what it says at this conference, and there's no denying that, is there?
Well, perhaps not, but Britain only has 1%, counts for 1% of Myanmar's global trade. So although it may be a good place to do business, this is not something Britain has been capitalizing on in the past.
And if it's a good place to do business, you're going to go there and do business, aren't you? Because that's what UK trade is about.
Well, I think the British government is promoting trade in Burma because it wants to increase trade for British businesses, but they're also saying that it's part of their development program for the country, that people need jobs, trade will help provide jobs, and certainly people in Burma, when you talk to them, it's one of the main things. People outside the ethnic states where they're under the brunt of the military attacks will say that jobs is one of the main things they want. So the British government is arguing that this is to help ordinary people in Burma.
Let's look at some of the figures here. Exports from here to Myanmar, Burma, whatever you want to call it, and the UN does call it Myanmar. Well, anywhere between $50 million and $100 million, depending on what you believe. Their exports to us around about 300 to 320 million. It's pretty small in overall terms, but we need them probably more than they need us, wouldn't you say?
Well, the British exports to Burma are mainly in services. You've got legal firms, consultancies that are there advising the government and the companies, multinational companies in the country on how to expand their investment and their operations, how to reform the country, areas like energy, agriculture. So they're helping the government draft a lot of the bills and the new laws and regulations to make it easier for business to operate.
See, I sort of think I know the answer to this already. You know, why would you want to slap sanctions on a country with which you want to do business when there is really no such thing as ethical foreign policy when it comes to trade?
I think
anywhere in the world.
Yeah, I think people are fairly. I mean, I think we're all agreed that what has happened to the Rohingya is frightful and unconscionable, and all that bunch of words that you would want to use. And so people feel that something has to be done, and therefore, if they talk about sanctions, they feel this sort of thing. From my point of view, and there are arguments on both sides about that. From my point of view, sanctions, because Myanmar is part of ASEAN,
the Association of Southeast Asian Nations,
yeah. Which is an economic bloc.
Yeah.
It's rather like the EEC used to be a million years ago. But the point is that if if you impose trade sanctions, leaving aside whether it hurts ordinary people, etc., if they want to import something, they will simply do it through Thailand. If they want to export something, they can do it through a Thai export port company. Now, there is still an arms embargo, and that is carefully monitored.
And we, the UK,
But,
have stopped supplying military training as
yes,
well.
but
worth 300,000.
And I think that in a sense it's a market thing, which is there are about 4 FTSE companies which are involved. You've got GlaxoSmithKline, which is actually selling medicine.
Vaccinations.
And do we want to stop that? I don't think we do.
There's a couple of oil companies, big bank.
You've got
But there aren't people
who jump in at
for
any
those
time,
kind of
Thomas.
sanctions.
And you
sure.
too, Danny,
There
just
are
feel free to join the conversation as and when.
So we try to respond to and partner with human rights organisations in the country, Rohingya organisations and others. And until sort of quite recently, they were quite united in saying we don't want general broad sanctions because that's going to hurt ordinary people and maybe miss the target of.
And the Rohingya representative saying the same thing.
So this is what things are starting to change now. So we have been told by Rohingya representatives in the past, we don't want the withdrawal of everything but arms trade privileges that the EU's got. We don't want general trade sanctions because that will just turn the population in the country against us even more. Instead, they were saying target the military-owned businesses, target the military directly, expand the arms embargo beyond just a handful of countries that have got it now. But that's starting to change now. We're starting to see Rohingya and some other ethnic people who are really bearing the brunt of the military attacks,
Thomas,
saying that they want more general trade sanctions.
Can I ask you a question before you come in with what you wanted to say? Because you mentioned the fact that they said target specific industries associated with the military. Pretty much every industry in Myanmar is associated with the military.
Yeah, I think any of the big industries that you're going to be targeting are connected in some way to the military. And the point about sanctions is, and you mentioned it, is one of the things it does is sends a signal if it's not, if they don't actually work that well. They send a signal at least to the government that we're unhappy with the human rights regime going on at the moment. But we're well beyond the issue of human rights now. We're talking about genocide. We're talking about international crime. So we're well beyond the sanctions. And to see an investment conference, which is basically the opposite of sanctions, this is about encouraging investment in a country, just sends a signal to the Burmese government that what they've done to the Rohingya is okay by us and continue on as you are at the moment.
Danny, do you want to jump in?
I was just going to make the point that sanctions, especially in this case, are largely futile from Britain, given that China is Myanmar's main trading partner. Any action which Britain takes would have to take place on a multilateral level to actually have any effect. So really, I think the question we need to be asking is one of morality and whether Britain's conscience can allow it to trade with a country which has been accused of textbook genocide by the UN.
Let's talk about China at this particular point, because if the government of Burma, Myanmar, suffers and the people of Burma suffer, then they're going to be driven more towards the nearest neighbour, their nearest massive industrial partner.
It's been going on for years.
And that is China.
Yeah.
But that is what the West doesn't want to see.
But nor do the government of Burma or the military in Burma. I mean, part of the sort of so-called reform process that's been taking place since 2010 is about moving away from coming under the dominance of China. They don't like that. They don't want that. So there's avenues of influence. But I think sanctions alone are not going to do anything. You know, what you need to see is a whole broad range of joined up diplomatic efforts to look at where you can apply leverage on the military especially, because we're talking about Burma as a whole, but it's not, there's two governments in Burma now. There's the military, which is responsible for the vast majority of human rights violations and controls part of the government, and then there's Aung San Suu Kyi's civilian-led government that controls other parts. They're both responsible for different human rights violations, so they've both got questions that need to be answered. Well, they both need pressure,
you
but
wrote
it's different forms
the biography
of pressure.
Yes.
Well, Suu Kyi. Are they all in this together? Are they as complicit as one another?
Yes. I mean, Aung San Suu Kyi at the moment, she's, although she's now derided worldwide, and by the way, I am in favour of targeted sanctions against individuals, and that would include Aung San Suu Kyi. But she is inside the country. She's Queen Bee. She's got where she wants to be. She always wanted to be, the national leader. She may not have quite as much power as her father once had, but and her father was the founder of modern Burma, independent Burma. Burma. But really, what goes on inside the country is so different from what we think of these people from the outside, and that's just how it is.
Can we explore what Mark was saying there, that the Burmese country per se does not want to still be in the arms of China, or whether in fact that is just
I think Mark's
an
right
outward
about
impression that they're
Yes, I
giving?
think
It
Mark's
seems the right
right
thing to
about
say.
that, but in a way they don't have there's just been a huge new power station opened in near Mandalay in the mid-north, which is basically a Chinese thing, and the Chinese have come over the border. The Chinese-Myanmar border hardly exists anymore. So the Chinese have done incredibly well, and it's part of historic Chinese regional hegemony. So, of course, these Burmese generals don't want to be beholden to anyone at all, but they are a relatively small state in a world of superstates.
But China, if we talk about the crime side of things, China here, if this were to, if there became a clamour for this to go to the International Criminal Court, it would have to go before the Security Council at the United Nations, at which China, as a permanent member of the Permanent Five, has a veto. So it probably wouldn't go through, would it?
It probably wouldn't go through, and it's the same argument about, China as a way of getting around sanctions, China as a way of getting around a referral. But if we see these sanctions going in and we see referral going onto the table, then history will judge China for vetoing it. But at least the Burmese government will be able to see that actually what we have done is considered wrong by the international community, and they're coming after us for doing it. At the moment, they just have carte blanche to continue on acting as they have been. And China are also, heavily involved in what happened to the Rohingya in the first place. There's a massive pipeline going through Rakhine State that the local Rakhine Buddhists had been protesting to the government about. And the government turned to them and said, listen, China and us are not your problem. Yes, you have the second or poorest state despite the resources, but your problem are the Rohingya. Deal with them first, and then we can get on to these other issues. So their influence in the state was right from the beginning.
So we pretty much got to rule out a referral to the International Criminal Court because the Security Council was involved with that. So we could then go to the United Nations General Assembly, which would set up a special tribunal, as was the case with the former Yugoslavia. But that then requires the cooperation of the Myanmar authorities to send those people indicted.
Well, absolutely. But if we take a step back, the International Criminal Court was in Bangladesh this week doing its investigations. There is an opening for jurisdiction through Bangladesh. Because of the crime, deportation requires two states. You have to, by definition, deport from one state to another. Bangladesh is a signatory to the ICC, so the ICC were there looking at this issue. And now, of course, it's going to be a serious problem for them to get evidence, to get defendants,
it is
and
what
get
they
access.
call a preliminary investigation.
It is a preliminary
investigation,
and we're going to find out soon. But it's a very novel way of seizing jurisdiction, and people are looking at it for Syria now as well. And it's an opening up for the ICC that might circumnavigate the Security Council.
I think it's what we need to see is we need to look at legal avenues, diplomatic avenues, economic pressure, expanding the UN. There's an arms embargo that the EU, US and a handful of countries have, but other countries could start joining that arms embargo.
Well, shall we get Danny to talk about the EU position on this, since you happen to be in Brussels? And Justin was mentioning targeting sanctions against individuals. This is the UK list of those against whom it has applied asset freezes. It's got 14 names on it. They are from Brigadier General down to Corporal, and mostly they're involved in the atrocities at the particular border crossing, which may or may not exist, up in that area. Why are they not going after the big cheeses here? And the same applies to the European Union.
Well, that really comes from a political level, but what we're actually seeing is with Cecilia Malmstrom and the DG of Trade is that they are continuing to monitor the situation closely, and that there is talk here in Brussels about whether to revoke Myanmar's EBA, everything but arms, access. But from the example of Cambodia, where it was actually announced last October that EBA access would be revoked, this is a process which takes quite a long time. I mean, it can take up to 18 months.
And is there any way of expediting it, Danny?
Well, not really, because we need to analyze the actual impact assessment of doing these potential sanctions against leading figures. figures isn't as difficult as sanctions against a country in totality, but it still is a process where you have to analyse the impacts which will happen.
And this is why the EU it's such a mess with its approach. So this visa ban and asset freeze, they froze these assets of 14 people knowing they had no assets to freeze. So nothing's happened. It's a non-sanction. A visa ban...
Can you tell me why, in your opinion, they did that against these particular individuals rather than against those who have a great deal of money and a great deal of power?
Countries like Germany, within the internal debates going on within the EU, countries like Germany objected to those kind of sanctioning. The top leaders, they say, we need to keep channels of communication open. So Germany, even in the same year as these attacks took place, Germany had hosted Min Aung Hlaing, the head of the military, and other senior generals, taken them around tours of arms supplies and sold them
Does that make a mockery
training
of
aircraft.
what is happening?
Well, I mean, there's a travel ban on these people to the Western democracies, but I doubt that they want to go anywhere near the Western democracy at the moment. They get a lot of the services they need through Singapore, which is a very important part of the Myanmar jigsaw.
But these level of people would never have travelled anyway.
That's right. No,
I
that's
mean,
right.
they've been banned on
Exactly.
going on holiday to countries they never would have gone on
Exactly,
holiday
that's
to
what I'm
anyway.
saying.
So my
That's it.
question is to anybody, nobody
just going
particularly, is
back-
it making a mockery of
Just going
This
back
is,
to
yes.
our starting point, where you started off by saying it's a great place for investment and trade, etc.
not my opinion, but
Well, no.
that's what's in the brochure.
That's right. But that's not quite right, because inward investment into Myanmar in the last 2 years, from the West particularly, has gone down a lot. There's a hint of desperation, certainly on the Myanmar side. There's probably, with Brexit looming, we want to do trade deals where we can. We've done a trade deal with the Azores.
This is where I was going next.
Right. Well, I'm
We're
ahead
not
of
going to
you.
be tied with the European Union policy.
I'm
We're going
ahead
to be
of you.
looking for
Can we-
any chance we can get.
But just going back to that original point about it being a sort of investment and trading opportunity, I think it's more fragile than that, actually.
And I think I would be very careful if I was a business getting involved in Burma at the moment.
Exactly.
I'm reminded of the Total case, where they were the first company ever to be prosecuted for crimes against humanity for working with the Burmese government. And this is going to be resurrected again now. Any company going in now has to be aware that there's going to be serious implications for them, reputationally, financially, and possibly criminal prosecutions for working with the...
Remind us what happened with Total. It was a prosecution, but what happened?
So in the end, it was stopped in Brussels. It was a prosecution for universal jurisdiction. So this is where we can prosecute crimes anywhere in the world if they're international level. The prosecution was stopped eventually, but the risk that it posed to Total was significant from the point of view of their bottom line. So if I was a company, I would be very careful.
A gun was pointed at Total's head, but the chambers were empty, pretty much.
Well, I think
As it turned out.
some of the chamber was let off on them because of the reputational damage they will have suffered from defending themselves for working with an international criminal regime. And this could come back to haunt any of the companies that are looking to invest now.
I was at this conference on Monday, and it's quite bizarre because...
How were you welcomed, first of all?
Well, I had to buy a ticket to get in, so... but it was quite bizarre because you've got British and Burmese government officials, British and Burmese companies, all there to talk about investment and desperately trying to avoid talking about one of the main factors influencing investment, which was human rights. The only time that the UN fact-finding mission's report, which concluded there was genocide, was referred to was by somebody who was saying that they said they don't support general sanctions.
Are we seeing double standards here, in your opinion?
Yes, we are, yeah.
Are we ever going to see anything other than double standards?
I hope we will. I think that the problem we're going to have with the EU, for example, is that Britain's policy is not good anymore on Burma, but they were one of the best within the EU. They were usually the country within the EU that was pushing for a stronger approach on human rights. So we can expect the EU policy to become even softer than it is.
I'll throw that one at Danny in just a moment, but Justin, yeah.
No, I was going to say, is this quite extraordinary? If you go online and you look at the Department of International Trade in the Myanmar page, it talks about communal conflict in Rakhine State, which is where the Rohingya come from. There's no actual mention of this whole refugee crisis, what the UN have now decided. And I find that
and just to give context,
pretty
this
appalling,
communal
actually.
conflict idea is the government line in Burma. This is
Yeah,
how
well,
they
that's
try
right.
to
That's right.
deflect any attention from this state-led campaign against the Rohingya.
So rather than it being a diplomatic statement on its website, it's a hypocritical statement.
It is a statement buying the government's line, continuing to buy the government's line after repeatedly being shown that they're being
deliberately
duped.
downplaying human rights issues because they want to promote trade.
And there
So
are
that
human rights.
helps the government get away with these abuses.
There
how
are
about
human
this?
rights
Yeah.
obligations for companies getting involved, but I want to iterate that we are beyond human rights obligations. We're talking about international crime obligations here. That's a whole different level of playing field for companies to get involved with.
Okay.
mean,
As we come to the end of the program, I want to ask you what you think might happen in terms of those international crimes. But
Can I add very
Go.
very quickly? I think that, especially with Mark here, if I were an activist, I think the big companies who are looking at Burma are well aware of the political difficulties.
I have to say, as we produce a dirty list of naming and shaming companies that are doing business
Well,
with the
very
military,
good.
some of them are not even aware they're in business
What-
with the military.
take a look at the
what I would
Myanmar British
say
Business
is that,
Association. I'll show you that in a
if I
second.
were an activist, I would devote a lot of my energy to telling such companies what the reality. And I'm sure that you're doing
That is what we're doing.
Exactly.
And we've now got 50 companies on a dirty
Yeah.
list, naming and shaming them for being in Burma, doing business with the military or projects associated with human rights violations.
Danny, the suggestion in the studio was that without the UK, one second if you don't mind, Justin, the suggestion here was that without the UK in the European Union, then the general European response is going to be that much more wishy-washy than it is at the moment.
Well, that is dealing with a hypothetical there. I don't think we can make that comment fairly. But what we are seeing is that the EU is taking a long time to make up its mind and progress with any decisions regarding Myanmar sanctions. Britain unilaterally would be able to act quicker, but the range of the measures and the scope that it can implement would be less.
Let's come back. Thank you, Danny. Thank you very much indeed. Let's come back to sort of nothing changes. You talked about the British government's website. I've looked at the Myanmar British Business Association website, and in the run-up to all that pressure at the UN General Assembly last September, I think it was, you get headlines like fifth gas discovery and offshore block. Going back another month, the cost of doing business in Yangon. Government releases regulations for new company law. Now, you wouldn't expect anything but business statements from companies doing business in Myanmar, but that's all it's talking about opportunity here. And is that ever going to change?
I don't think businesses are ever going to stop looking for opportunities, but I think businesses will weigh up the risks. And if there's no risk to them as they see it, because the British government is telling them there's no risk to go in, then they're going to be encouraged to go in and invest in the country. But I really think that's going to come back and bite them in the bottom later on, because they will have been involved with a genocidal regime, and then depending on what services they might provide to them, they might be looking at complicity in this.
Okay, well, it's moved on a long way in that case from, let's go back to the apartheid times when Barclays was heavily involved over there. It suffered reputationally, but it didn't get.
Well, there are still companies.
Really,
there are still companies being sued in South Africa today, banks included, for their participation in the regime. So it's still hanging on for a lot of companies.
Perhaps like the Total one, it'll just hang on and make lots of money for the lawyers rather than for anybody else.
I mean, I'm sure that's true, but the Total had to fight very hard to protect their reputation, and they won't be getting involved with any regime like this anytime in the future.
The possibility is reputational damage, possible criminal proceedings rather than sanctions targeted at the country as a whole. Is that what the general feeling is here?
But that's what we're reduced to, because the international community, governments, the EU, the US and others have completely failed to act. And they're not making the correlation between, we saw that when the sanctions that were in place in the past were lifted, human rights violations increased. The military felt the pressure is off, they can get away with this now. And so they've committed this genocide and stepped up attacks against other ethnic minorities in the country because they believe they can get away with it. And so far they've been proved right. They have got away with it. A dozen people now can't go on holiday in the EU, US and Australia.
Very quickly,
that's
I
the
may.
only price they paid for genocide.
One name has stood out in the politics of Myanmar for the last 20, 25 years, and that's Aung San Suu Kyi. You wrote the biography of her. If you don't mind wrapping up very quickly, talking about reputational damage, can she ever recover her reputation?
I think it's true. A year ago, I would have said that what she could and should have done is to go into voluntary exile and start a fresh campaign against the military. And it is essentially a military government. but I don't think that she's going to do that. We're talking here, we've been talking really about ethical foreign policy, and there's very little of that in the world. You look at Saudi Arabia and the trade there, it's no good.
So you don't think there's any coming back for her?
No, because she's where she wants to be. I mean, it's not a coming back for her. It's in terms of international reputation.
That's what I meant.
Yeah. She's getting old now. She's not very well. She's not going to go into voluntary exile, and she's going to just sit it out.
Which is perhaps, thank you very much indeed, all of you, for coming on the programme, which is perhaps what the government in Myanmar is rather hoping will happen when it comes to the genocide that has been declared as such by the United Nations happening to the Rohingya Muslims up in Rakhine State. That's what we've been talking about, international business and human rights, where they interlock. You've been watching Roundtable. Thanks for coming on the programme. I hope if we've achieved anything, we've drawn some little attention to it. From me, David Foster, from the team, thank you for watching. Hope to have your company next time. Goodbye.